The dust settled like a shroud on Felicity Calloway's worn boots as she trudged down the main street of Copper Creek. Her eyes fixed on the ground to avoid the stares that followed her everywhere in town. The whispers began as they always did, carried on the dry Arizona breeze of 1878 like tumbleweeds, sharp and unwelcome. "Here comes filthy Felicity," a woman's voice sliced through the afternoon air. Felicity clutched her basket tighter, the few vegetables she'd managed to grow on her struggling plot of land nestled inside. At 22, her hands were already rough and cracked from working the unforgiving soil of a homestead left to her when both parents succumbed to fever 3 winters ago. The dress she wore had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, but it was clean, always clean, despite what the townsfolk said. "Don't get too close, Martha," came another voice. "You might catch whatever makes her allergic to soap." Laughter rippled through the group of women standing outside the mercantile. Felicity's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She needed to sell these vegetables, or there would be no flour for bread this week. Her chin lifted slightly despite the humiliation that weighed on her narrow shoulders. 3 more steps to the mercantile door. The sound of galloping hooves drew everyone's attention away from her momentarily. A new distraction, thank God. A lone rider appeared at the end of the street, his silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. Even from a distance, Felicity could see he sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders and the distinctive Stetson marking him as one of those cowboys passing through on cattle drives. Vaughn Yates pulled back on the reins, slowing his chestnut stallion as he reached the center of town. He'd been on the trail for weeks with the cattle drive from Texas, and Copper Creek was supposed to be just another stop before pushing north to the railroad in Colorado. The town looked like 100 others he'd passed through, wooden buildings bleached by the sun. The saloon already doing business despite the early hour, ladies in their finest watching from boardwalks. His eyes scanned the street, taking in the scene with the practiced wariness of a man who'd survived 15 years on the frontier. At 30, Vaughn had seen enough of humanity to know that small towns often harbored the ugliest spirits. He noticed immediately the young woman with downcast eyes hurrying toward the mercantile, and the group of well-dressed women watching her with unmistakable disdain. Something about the set of the young woman's shoulders, proud despite her obvious poverty, caught his attention. She looked like a wild creature being circled by wolves. Dismounting with fluid grace, Vaughn tied his horse to the hitching post. His spurs jangled against the wooden boardwalk as he approached the mercantile, arriving at the door just as the young woman reached for the handle. "Pardon me, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat and opening the door for her. Felicity froze, startled by the courteous gesture. She dared to look up, meeting the bluest eyes she'd ever seen in a sun-bronzed face. The cowboy stood at least a head taller than her, with dark hair curling from beneath his hat and a clean-shaven jaw that set him apart from many of the men who passed through town. "Thank you," she murmured, so unused to common courtesy that the words felt foreign on her tongue. "Don't waste your manners on her, stranger," called out one of the women. "That's Felicity Calloway. We call her Filthy Felicity round here." Felicity's stomach clenched as if she'd been struck. She ducked her head again and tried to hurry past the cowboy into the mercantile. Vaughn's gaze hardened as he looked from the young woman's mortified expression to the smirking faces of the town women. In that moment, he saw something that struck a chord deep within him, not just the cruelty that humans were capable of, but the quiet dignity in the young woman's bearing despite it. "Is that so?" he said, his voice carrying across the street with deceptive softness. "Funny, I was just thinking she was the cleanest thing I've seen in this dust bowl of a town." The women's smiles faltered. Vaughn deliberately turned his back on them and followed Felicity into the store. Inside, the mercantile smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. Mr. Winters, the proprietor, barely glanced up from his ledger as Felicity approached the counter and carefully set down her basket. "I've brought vegetables to trade, Mr. Winters," she said quietly. "The same as usual." The storekeeper eyed the contents of her basket with barely concealed disdain. "Not much here, Miss Calloway. Can't give you more than 2 bits worth of credit." "But last week you gave me twice that for the same amount," Felicity protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Times are hard. Take it or leave it." Mr. Winters turned a page in his ledger, clearly considering the matter closed. Vaughn leaned against a nearby barrel, watching the exchange while pretending to examine a display of tobacco. Something about the young woman's situation nagged at him, reminding him of his own mother's struggles after his father died. He'd been 10 years old, watching his once respected mother slowly become an outcast in their small Texas town, simply because poverty had touched her. "Those look like mighty fine vegetables to me," Vaughn said, approaching the counter. "In fact, I'd be interested in purchasing them directly." Both Felicity and the storekeeper looked at him in surprise. "Sir, you don't need to," Felicity began. "I insist," Vaughn interrupted smoothly, reaching into his pocket and placing a silver dollar on the counter. "Would this cover it, miss?" Felicity's eyes widened at the coin. It was more money than she'd seen in months, certainly more than her vegetables were worth, even at fair market value. "I can't accept that," she said, her pride warring with necessity. "It's too much." "Not from where I'm standing," Vaughn replied. "Trail food gets mighty tiresome. Fresh vegetables are worth their weight in gold to a man who's been eating salt pork and beans for weeks." Mr. Winters snorted. "If you're fool enough to pay that much for a few scraggly carrots and potatoes, Cowboy, that's your business." Vaughn's smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked at the storekeeper. "I'd say the only fool business I see is a man turning away honest trade from a hardworking neighbor." He turned back to Felicity. "Do we have a deal, miss?" After a moment's hesitation, Felicity nodded, carefully taking the silver dollar. "Thank you, Mr. Yates, Vaughn Yates." He tipped his hat to her. "And you're Miss Calloway, I gather." "Felicity," she confirmed, tucking the coin into her pocket with hands that trembled slightly. No one in town had spoken to her with such respect in years. "Well, Miss Felicity," Vaughn said, picking up the basket of vegetables, "would you mind showing me where I might get a decent meal in this town? Seems I might need someone to prepare these vegetables properly, and I'd be willing to pay for the service." Felicity hesitated, aware of Mr. Winters' narrowed eyes and the inevitable gossip this interaction would generate. But the silver dollar in her pocket represented security she hadn't felt in months, and there was something in Vaughn Yates' direct gaze that made her believe he was being genuine. "The boarding house serves meals," she said finally, "but they wouldn't use your vegetables. I could cook them for you at my cabin if you're not opposed to simple fare." Mr. Winters made a choking sound. "Miss Calloway, that's hardly appropriate. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Winters," Vaughn cut in, his tone making it clear it was anything but concern. "But I reckon Miss Calloway and I can manage our own affairs." Outside, the group of women were still lingering, their conversation stopping abruptly as Vaughn and Felicity emerged from the mercantile. Felicity instinctively hunched her shoulders, preparing for another barrage of comments, but Vaughn stepped slightly in front of her, his tall frame shielding her from their direct stares. "My horse is just over here," he said conversationally, as if escorting a lady through town was the most natural thing in the world. "Would you like to ride? My cabin's a fair distance." "No, thank you," Felicity replied. "It's not far and I'm used to walking." As they moved past the group of women, one of them, a blonde in a blue dress that probably cost more than everything Felicity owned, stepped forward. "Mr. Yates, is it?" she said, fluttering her eyelashes. "I'm Lucinda Porter. My father owns the bank. We'd be delighted to have you for dinner this evening. There's no need for you to settle for less than the best Copper Creek has to offer." Her meaning was clear in the contemptuous glance she shot at Felicity. Vaughn smiled, but it was the cold smile that never quite thawed his eyes. "That's mighty kind, Miss Porter, but I've already made arrangements with Miss Calloway. Perhaps another time." You don't understand, Lucinda persisted, lowering her voice. She lives in squalor out there. They say she doesn't even have proper furniture since she sold it all after her parents died. It's primitive. I've slept under the stars with my saddle for a pillow more nights than I can count, Miss Porter, Vaughn replied. I reckon primitive accommodations don't scare me much. He touched his hat brim. Ladies, enjoy your afternoon. With that, he untied his horse and fell into step beside Felicity, who was already moving briskly down the street, her cheeks burning with humiliation. You don't have to do this, she said once they were out of earshot. I know they've probably told you all sorts of things about me. Miss Calloway, Vaughn said, leading his horse alongside her. In my experience, people who spend that much time talking about others generally don't have much worth saying. I'd rather form my own opinions. They walked in silence for a while, leaving the town behind and following a dirt path that wound through scrubby mesquite and prickly pear cactus. The Arizona landscape spread out around them, rugged and beautiful in its own harsh way. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the sky, and hawks circled lazily on the thermals. Felicity snuck glances at the cowboy walking beside her. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon in the habit of someone who'd learned to spot trouble before it found him. She wondered what had prompted his kindness and when he would inevitably regret it. How long have you lived out here alone? Vaughn asked, breaking the silence. 3 years, Felicity replied. Since I was 19. My parents both caught the fever, father first, then mother while nursing him. That's a long time to manage on your own, Felicity shrugged. You do what you must. Why stay here? Folks in town don't seem particularly neighborly. The land is mine, the only thing my parents could leave me, and despite what you may have heard in town, I keep it clean my house, my clothes, myself. The words came out more defensively than she intended. Vaughn's gaze was steady. I never thought otherwise. They crested a small rise, and Felicity's homestead came into view, a modest cabin with a lean-to stable attached, a small garden plot, and a chicken coop. The place was humble but meticulously maintained. The cabin's porch had been recently swept, the garden was free of weeds, and lines of washing hung in the yard, flapping in the breeze. It's not much, Felicity said, suddenly seeing her home through a stranger's eyes. Looks like honest living to me, Vaughn replied, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he meant it. As they approached the cabin, a border collie came bounding out to meet them, barking excitedly. Down, Scout, Felicity called, and the dog immediately sat at her feet, tail sweeping the dirt. He won't bite, she assured Vaughn. He just doesn't see many visitors. Makes 2 of us, Vaughn said with a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. He reached down to let the dog sniff his hand before scratching behind its ears. You can tie your horse to that post, Felicity said, pointing. There's water in the trough. While Vaughn saw to his horse, Felicity hurried inside, suddenly painfully aware of her humble surroundings. Lucinda Porter hadn't been entirely wrong. Felicity had indeed sold most of her parents' furniture to pay for medicines during their illness and food afterward. What remained was simple and sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, a narrow bed in the corner screened by a faded curtain, and a rocking chair by the fireplace. But everything was spotlessly clean, the rough wooden floor swept, the few dishes arranged neatly on a shelf. She quickly splashed water on her face from the basin and smoothed her hair, tucked in the stray strands that had escaped her simple braid. It was vanity, she knew, and likely pointless. A man like Vaughn Yates would never look twice at someone like her, but she couldn't help it. When Vaughn ducked through the low doorway a few minutes later, he carried not only the basket of vegetables but also his saddlebags. Brought some coffee and a few supplies, he explained. Thought I might contribute to the meal, seeing as you're doing the cooking. Felicity accepted the offerings with murmured thanks, still not entirely sure what to make of this strange situation. It had been so long since she'd had a guest, longer still since anyone had shown her kindness without an ulterior motive. As she set about preparing a simple stew with the vegetables and some dried beef Vaughn had contributed, she became acutely aware of his presence in the small cabin. He seemed to fill the space, not just physically, but with a kind of quiet intensity that made the air feel charged. "Can I help?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the small work table. The question surprised her. "You know how to cook," Vaughn smiled. "A man on the trail either learns to cook or starves. I won't claim to be good at it, but I can follow directions." Felicity hesitated, then handed him a knife. "You could cut these potatoes while I start the broth." They worked side by side, and gradually Felicity's tension began to ease. Vaughn told her about the cattle drive he was on, moving 2,000 head from Texas to the railhead in Colorado, about the thunderstorm that had nearly caused a stampede last week, about the cook who could somehow produce sourdough biscuits over a campfire that rivaled any bakeries. In turn, Felicity found herself talking more than she had in months, explaining how she managed to coax vegetables from the challenging soil, about the chicken that laid eggs with double yolks, about how she'd taught herself to repair the cabin roof after a windstorm had damaged it last winter. "You've done remarkably well," Vaughn said as they sat down to eat the stew. "Many men couldn't have managed what you have." Felicity looked down at her bowl, unused to praise. "Necessity teaches quickly." "So does character," Vaughn replied, "and you've got plenty of that." As they ate, the sun began to set, painting the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink visible through the cabin's small window. Vaughn asked more about Copper Creek and its residents, and Felicity explained how things had changed after her parents died. "They were respected in town when they were alive," she said. "Father was a teacher before his lungs got bad and we had to move west for the dry air. Mother used to give piano lessons to some of the children, but after they died and I couldn't keep up with everything, people's attitudes changed." "People fear what can happen to them," Vaughn said. "Seeing someone fall from prosperity to poverty reminds them how precarious their own position might be. It's easier to blame the person than to acknowledge the fragility of their own circumstances." Felicity looked at him with new interest. "You sound like you've given this some thought." "My mother faced something similar after my father died," Vaughn admitted. "We lost everything, and suddenly people who'd taken tea in our parlor couldn't remember her name when they passed her on the street." "I'm sorry," Felicity said softly. "What happened to her?" A shadow crossed Vaughn's face. "She died when I was 16, worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep a roof over our heads." He was quiet for a moment. "I left Texas after that, signed on with a cattle outfit, been riding the trails ever since." The simple meal finished, Felicity rose to clear the dishes. "You must be eager to get back to town, to a proper bed at the hotel." Vaughn didn't move from his chair. "Actually, I was hoping I might impose on your hospitality a bit further. It's getting dark, and I'd rather not navigate unfamiliar territory at night. I'm happy to sleep in the lean-to with my horse." Felicity hesitated, aware of how it would look if anyone from town found out she'd allowed a man to stay on her property overnight. But the thought of company, of not spending another evening in silence with only Scout for conversation, was too tempting to resist. "The lean-to leaks when the dew is heavy," she said finally. "You can sleep here by the fire. I have an extra blanket." "Much obliged," Vaughn replied with a smile that warmed something inside her that had been cold for a very long time. As darkness settled over the cabin, Felicity lit an oil lamp and disappeared briefly behind the curtain that screened off her sleeping area. She emerged in the same dress, but had removed her boots and unpinned her hair, which fell in a dark cascade down her back. The lamplight caught golden highlights in the brown strands, and for a moment, Vaughn couldn't look away. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash," she said, gesturing to a small stand near the door. "Thank you." Vaughn removed his hat and gun belt, hanging them carefully on a peg by the door. He splashed water on his face and through his hair, aware of Felicity moving around the cabin, spreading a blanket near the banked fire for him. When he turned back, she was sitting in the rocking chair, her fingers busy with some mending. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd experienced this kind of quiet evening companionship? On the cattle drives, nights were filled with the sounds of restless cattle, the murmur of men playing cards, the cook banging pots. This peaceful silence, broken only by the gentle creak of the rocking chair, felt almost sacred. "Would you mind if I asked you something, Miss Calloway?" Vaughn said, settling onto the blanket by the fire, Felicity's hands stilled on her mending. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." Vaughn stretched his long legs out toward the warmth. "Why don't you leave? Start fresh somewhere people don't know you, don't have these preconceived notions about who you are." Felicity was quiet for so long that Vaughn thought she might have decided not to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "This land is all I have left of them, my parents. They came here with such hope. Father's health was better at first. They had plans to expand the garden, maybe plant an orchard." Her fingers traced the worn fabric she was mending. "Leaving would feel like admitting defeat, like their dreams died with them. As long as I'm here working this land, something of them survives." Vaughn nodded, understanding all too well. "And the people in town, how do you bear their cruelty?" Felicity's smile was sad but not bitter. "I don't go to town often, just when necessary. And I've learned that what others think of me matters less than what I know to be true." "That's a wisdom many never achieve," Vaughn said softly. They talked into the night, the fire burning low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Felicity spoke of her childhood in St. Louis before her father's illness, of books she loved, of the piano music she still heard in her head sometimes. Vaughn told her about the places he'd seen on cattle drives, the vast emptiness of the Texas Panhandle, the majestic mountains of Colorado, the strange beauty of the desert at dawn. It was well past midnight when Felicity finally rose, stifling a yawn. "I should let you rest. Morning comes early here." "That it does," Vaughn agreed, though he felt reluctant to end their conversation. Something about Felicity Calloway intrigued him, her resilience, her quiet dignity, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when she spoke of things that mattered to her. "Good night, Mr. Yates," she said, disappearing behind her curtain. "Good night, Miss Calloway," he replied, settling onto his makeshift bed. As he drifted toward sleep, Vaughn found himself thinking that his impulsive decision to champion the solitary young woman in town might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. He'd been drawn by a desire to right an injustice, to stand against the small-town cruelty that had once been directed at his own mother. He hadn't expected to find someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed, whose strength he admired, whose presence made him question the rootless life he'd been living for 14 years. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Felicity woke to the unfamiliar sounds of someone moving quietly in her home, the soft clink of the coffee pot, the subtle creak of floorboards under a heavy tread. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she felt a flash of panic. Then the events of the previous day came back to her, and she remembered her unexpected guest. Quickly dressing behind the curtain, Felicity emerged to find Vaughn had not only stoked the fire, but had coffee brewing and was slicing bread from the loaf she'd baked 2 days earlier. "Hope you don't mind," he said, glancing up with a smile. "Thought I'd make myself useful." "Not at all," Felicity replied, surprised by the domestic scene. "Thank you." They shared a simple breakfast of bread with honey from Felicity's beehive and strong black coffee. Outside, the day promised to be clear and warm, typical Arizona weather for early summer. "I should get back to the herd," Vaughn said as they finished eating. "The boys will be wondering what happened to me." Felicity nodded, ignoring the pang of disappointment. Of course he had to go. Men like Vaughn Yates didn't linger in one place, certainly not for women like her. "Thank you for your hospitality," Vaughn continued, rising to collect his hat and gun belt. Best meal and conversation I've had in longer than I care to remember. Thank you for the trade, Felicity replied, falling back on practicality to mask the emotions swirling beneath the surface. It was more than fair. Outside, Scout circled excitedly as Vaughn saddled his horse. The morning sun lit the surrounding landscape, highlighting the stark beauty of the desert. In the distance, the mountains rose blue against the horizon. Will you be staying in Copper Creek long? Felicity found herself asking as Vaughn prepared to mount. A few days, maybe a week, he replied. The herd needs rest before the push to Colorado, and there's decent grazing north of town. He paused, one foot in the stirrup. Would it be all right if I called on you again, Miss Calloway? The question caught her off guard. Called on me? Vaughn's smile was gentle. Yes, madam. Called on you properly, like a gentleman visiting a lady he admires. Felicity felt her cheeks warm. People will talk. People always talk, Vaughn replied with a shrug. Question is, do we give them the power to determine our actions? Put that way, the answer seemed obvious. Still, Felicity hesitated. Why would you want to? Call on me, I mean. Vaughn's blue eyes held her steadily. Because in one evening, you've shown me more genuine character, intelligence, and grace than most people I've met in years of traveling. Because talking with you feels like finding something I didn't know I was missing. He smiled again, a hint of self-deprecation in the expression. And because you're the most beautiful woman I've seen in a very long time, especially when you're not trying to disappear. Felicity couldn't help the small gasp that escaped her. No one had called her beautiful since her mother died. Certainly not in the last 3 years, when hard work and harder times had left little room for feminine vanities. You don't have to say that, she said softly. I don't say things I don't mean, Miss Calloway, Vaughn replied, his voice equally soft but firm with conviction. Life's too short for meaningless words. A moment stretched between them, taut with possibilities. Finally, Felicity nodded. Yes, Mr. Yates, you may call on me again. His smile widened, genuine pleasure lighting his features. I'll be back tomorrow then, if that suits you. Tomorrow, Felicity confirmed, and was surprised to find herself smiling back. Vaughn swung into the saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to convey both respect and something warmer, more personal. Then he turned his horse toward town and was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Felicity stood watching long after he'd disappeared from view, one hand absently stroking Scout's head. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something dangerous ignite in her chest. Hope. True to his word, Vaughn returned the next day, and the next. Each visit brought small gifts, coffee beans, a book of poetry he'd found in a second-hand store in town, fresh fruit from a trader passing through. But more precious than the gifts was the companionship, the conversations that stretched into the evening, the laughter that gradually returned to Felicity's life like water seeping into parched ground. On his third visit, Vaughn helped her repair the chicken coop that had been damaged in the last windstorm. On the fourth, they rode together on his horse to a small hidden canyon where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, defying the desert's harshness. It was there, surrounded by nature's surprising beauty, that Vaughn first kissed her. The touch of his lips on hers was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Felicity found herself responding with a hunger that surprised them both, her hands coming up to frame his face as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both breathing quickly, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the first night, he confessed. Why didn't you? Felicity asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because some things are worth waiting for, he replied simply. In town, rumors swirled about the cowboy who was courting filthy Felicity. Some found it amusing, others scandalous. Lucinda Porter and her circle were particularly vocal in their disapproval, suggesting that Vaughn must be using Felicity for immoral purposes, that no respectable man would associate with such a woman. Vaughn heard the whispers when he went into town for supplies, but he paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the remarkable woman he was coming to know, her quiet strength, her sharp mind, the gentle heart she protected behind walls built from years of rejection and loss. A week stretched into 2, then 3. The cattle drive would need to move on soon if they were to reach Colorado before the first snows. Vaughn knew decisions would have to be made, conversations that couldn't be postponed any longer. But each day with Felicity made the thought of leaving more difficult. The rootless life he'd led for so many years suddenly seeming empty rather than free. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Vaughn rode into town with Felicity beside him on a gentle mare he'd purchased for her from the remuda. It was the first time she'd accompanied him to Copper Creek since their initial meeting, and he could feel her tension as they approached the outskirts. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can go alone." Felicity shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "No, I can't hide forever. And I need a few things from the mercantile." Her simple cotton dress was clean and pressed, her hair neatly braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. She sat straight in the saddle, refusing to hunch her shoulders or lower her gaze as they rode down the main street. The stares began immediately, followed by the whispers. Vaughn rode close beside her, his presence a shield against the worst of it. They dismounted outside the mercantile, and he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Felicity took a deep breath and placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. "Ready." Inside, Mr. Winter's eyebrows shot up at the sight of them together. Several other customers, including 2 of the women who had mocked Felicity during their first encounter, fell silent mid-conversation. "Good afternoon," Vaughn said pleasantly, tipping his hat to the room at large. No one responded. Felicity kept her chin up, though Vaughn could feel the slight tremor in her hand on his arm. "I need some flour and sugar, Mr. Winters," she said, her voice admirably steady. "And thread, if you have any in blue." The storekeeper hesitated, looking from Felicity to Vaughn and back again. We just got a shipment in yesterday. Got plenty." As he moved to gather the items, the whispers resumed, no longer bothering to be subtle. "Can't believe she has the nerve to show her face. I wonder what she's doing to keep him interested." Always knew she was no better than she ought to be. Vaughn felt Felicity's hand tighten on his arm, saw the flush creeping up her neck. He covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently in reassurance. Mr. Winters returned with the requested items. "That'll be 87 cents, he said, avoiding Felicity's eyes. As she reached for her coin purse, the mercantile door opened again, and Lucinda Porter swept in, followed by 2 other women from her social circle. She stopped short at the sight of Vaughn and Felicity. "Well," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the store, "if it isn't our town disgrace and her, protect her." She looked Felicity up and down, her lip curling. "I must say, Felicity, you clean up better than I would have expected. Is that what it takes to catch a man these days?" Pretending to be respectable after luring him out to your isolated cabin. The store fell completely silent. Felicity had gone rigid beside Vaughn, her face pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheekbones. "Miss Porter," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously soft, "I suggest you apologize to Miss Calloway immediately." Lucinda laughed, a brittle sound that held no mirth. "Apologize? For what?" Stating what everyone in town knows to be true. "She's been living in filth since her parents died, barely human, and suddenly she's parading around town on your arm like she belongs in decent company." "Lucinda," one of her companions murmured, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should." "No, Emily, I will not be silenced," Lucinda snapped. "Someone needs to speak the truth. She's filthy, inside and out, and no amount of 'that's enough.'" Vaughn's voice cut through the store like a whip crack. The cold fury in his tone made everyone flinch, even Lucinda. He turned to face Felicity, who stood frozen, humiliation and hurt evident in every line of her body. With deliberate care, Vaughn took both of her hands in his, raised them to his lips, and kissed first one, then the other. The gesture was tender, reverent, a public declaration that needed no words to interpret. A collective gasp went up from the onlookers. "These hands," Vaughn said, his voice pitched to carry through the stunned silence, "have worked harder than anyone in this room can imagine. They've coaxed life from barren soil, maintained a homestead alone that would challenge most men, created a home of dignity and cleanliness from next to nothing." His blue eyes blazed as he looked around the store, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "I've been in fine houses from Texas to Colorado, and I've never seen a more spotless home than Felicity Calloway's cabin. Never met a woman with more true grace or character, and I've certainly never encountered a community more blind to the treasure in their midst." He turned back to Felicity, whose eyes were wide with astonishment, glistening with unshed tears. Still holding her hands, Vaughn sank to one knee before her, oblivious to the gasps that rippled through the store. "Miss Felicity Calloway," he said, his voice gentling as he focused solely on her. "I came to Copper Creek expecting nothing more than a brief stop on a familiar journey. Instead, I found you brave, beautiful, and stronger than anyone has a right to be. I know it's sudden, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Felicity stared down at him, momentarily speechless. Around them, the mercantile had gone so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded thunderous. "Vaughn," she finally whispered, "are you certain? Here, now?" His smile was tender, unwavering. "Here, now, forever." A single tear spilled down Felicity's cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice strengthening. "Yes, I will marry you." Vaughn stood and, heedless of their audience, pulled her into his arms for a kiss that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. When they broke apart, both a little breathless, he turned to face the still stunned onlookers. "Mr. Winters," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I believe we have a few more items to purchase. My fiancé and I will need supplies for a wedding celebration." The word fiancé hung in the air like a challenge and a declaration. Mr. Winters, looking slightly dazed, nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Yates. Whatever you need." Lucinda Porter stood as if turned to stone, her face a mottled red. Without a word, she turned and stormed out of the store, her friends hurrying after her. The tension in the room broke. Several people stepped forward to offer awkward congratulations, their previous disdain for Felicity seemingly forgotten in the face of Vaughn's very public endorsement and proposal. Felicity accepted their good wishes with a quiet dignity that made Vaughn's heart swell with pride. As they left the mercantile an hour later, laden with supplies and trailing a wake of buzzing conversation, Felicity looked up at Vaughn with a mixture of wonder and lingering disbelief. "Did that really just happen?" she asked as he helped her mount the mare. Vaughn grinned, swinging up onto his own horse. "Which part, the proposal or me finally shutting up the gossips of Copper Creek?" "Both," Felicity admitted with a small laugh. "Especially the part where you kissed my hands." Her cheeks colored at the memory. "No one's ever done anything like that for me." "Get used to it," Vaughn said, his voice turning serious despite his smile. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life showing everyone, including you, exactly how remarkable you are." As they rode back toward Felicity's homestead, soon to be their homestead, the afternoon sun bathed the desert in golden light, turning the humble landscape into something beautiful and full of promise. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Word of Vaughn's dramatic proposal spread through Copper Creek like wildfire, transforming Felicity overnight from town pariah to the subject of intense curiosity and revised opinions. Suddenly, women who had previously crossed the street to avoid her were stopping by the homestead with casseroles and advice on married life, their previous cruelty apparently forgotten. Vaughn watched these visits with a sardonic eye, but said nothing, understanding better than most how quickly public opinion could shift. What mattered to him was the joy that was gradually relaxing the tension from Felicity's shoulders, bringing color to her cheeks and a sparkle to her eyes that made his breath catch whenever he looked at her. The trail boss, a grizzled man named Sullivan who had known Vaughn for years, rode out to the homestead when he heard the news. "So you're hanging up your spurs, Yates?" he asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Felicity. "Looks that way, Sully," Vaughn replied, his arm draped comfortably around Felicity's shoulders as they sat on the porch. "Found something worth staying for." Sullivan studied Felicity for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "About time. Been worried you'd end up a lonely old man with nothing but trail dust for company." He raised his cup in a toast. "To putting down roots. Never thought I'd see the day." The cattle drive would continue north without Vaughn, but with his blessing and a generous severance from his years of service. Several of his fellow cowboys rode out to wish him well, their initially skeptical expressions softening when they saw the way Vaughn looked at his bride-to-be. The wedding was set for the following Saturday, giving Felicity just enough time to sew a new dress from fabric Vaughn insisted on purchasing from the mercantile a soft blue cotton that matched her eyes. The ceremony would be small, held at the homestead rather than in town, with only a handful of guests. Sullivan and a few of the cowboys who hadn't yet departed with the herd, the local minister and his wife, and, surprisingly, Mr. Winters and his daughter from the mercantile, who had been among the first to offer genuine congratulations after the proposal. Noticeably absent from the guest list were Lucinda Porter and her circle, who had retreated into scandalized silence since the scene at the store. Rumors circulated that Lucinda had taken to her bed with a mysterious ailment that required frequent doses of laudanum. The night before the wedding, Vaughn stayed in town at the hotel, honoring tradition despite their already untraditional circumstances. Alone in the cabin for what would be her final night as a single woman, Felicity found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with memories and anticipation. She thought of her parents and wished they could have known Vaughn, could have seen how their daughter had finally found happiness despite the hardships. She remembered the countless nights of loneliness, the struggle to maintain her dignity in the face of the town's contempt, the moments of despair when she'd wondered if all her efforts were futile. And then she thought of Vaughn, his unexpected appearance in her life, his immediate defense of her honor, the way he looked at her as if she were precious and beautiful despite her worn clothes and work-roughened hands. The future that had once seemed so bleak now stretched before her full of possibilities. Dawn broke clear and perfect, the sky a canvas of pink and gold. Felicity bathed in water warmed on the stove, washed her hair with the lavender-scented soap that had been a gift from the minister's wife, and carefully dressed in her new blue gown. She had just finished pinning her hair in a simple but elegant style when a knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, come to help with the final preparations. A plump, cheerful woman in her 50s, she bustled into the cabin with an armful of wildflowers. "Good morning, my dear. Oh, don't you look lovely?" she exclaimed, setting down her burden. "Let's make you a bouquet, shall we?" Every bride needs flowers. As they worked, Mrs. Peterson chattered about her own wedding 30 years earlier, about the happiness she'd found with the minister despite the challenges of frontier life, about the joy of building a life with someone who truly valued you. "I always thought there was more to you than the town gossips claimed," she said as she tied a ribbon around the bouquet of desert blooms. "I should have spoken up sooner, been more welcoming. For that, I apologize." Felicity, touched by the honest admission, squeezed the older woman's hand. "Thank you, that means a great deal." "Well," Mrs. Peterson said briskly, blinking away sudden moisture in her eyes, "water under the bridge now. You found a good man in Mr. Yates. Anyone can see he adores you." A sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Peterson peeked out the window and smiled. Speaking of your Mr. Yates, he's here, and looking mighty handsome in a proper suit. Shall we go make you a married woman, my dear?" Felicity took a deep breath, her heart racing with anticipation rather than fear. "Yes," she said, certainty filling her voice. "Yes, I'm ready." Outside, the homestead had been transformed. The yard had been swept clean, the porch decorated with more wildflowers and ribbons. A simple arch of mesquite branches stood in the center, twined with desert blooms. Chairs borrowed from neighbors formed rows for the small gathering of guests, who stood as Felicity emerged from the cabin on Mrs. Peterson's arm. At the sight of her, Vaughn, standing tall and handsome in a new black suit beside the minister, seemed to forget to breathe. His eyes never left her as she walked toward him, a smile spreading across his face that made him look boyish despite the maturity of his features. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows and rings. Vaughn had ridden all the way to Tucson to find a matching pair, gold bands that gleamed in the morning sunlight. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Yates, you may kiss your bride." Vaughn took Felicity's face between his hands with exquisite tenderness. "Mrs. Yates," he murmured, just for her ears, before lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that sealed their commitment and promised a lifetime of passion and partnership. The small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. Even Scout joined in, barking excitedly as he circled the newlyweds. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, a feast spread on tables in the yard. Music from a fiddle played by one of the cowboys, dancing that continued as the afternoon sun began to lower toward the horizon. As dusk approached, the guests gradually departed, leaving Vaughn and Felicity alone at last. They stood on the porch, arms around each other, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" Vaughn asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Felicity replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, no regrets about giving up the trail?" Vaughn turned her to face him, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Not a single one. The trail was my escape, Felicity. I've been running from putting down roots since my mother died, afraid to care too much about any place or person." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "Until you make me want to build something that lasts." As darkness settled over the land, they moved inside the cabin that would now be theirs together. The single room that had once felt so empty to Felicity now seemed perfectly sized for two people beginning a life together. In the privacy of their first night as husband and wife, they discovered each other fully, their passion tempered by tenderness, their bodies learning the language that their hearts already spoke fluently. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, they talked of dreams and plans, expanding the cabin, improving the garden, perhaps adding a few cattle to start a small herd of their own. "I was thinking," Vaughn said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Felicity's bare shoulder, "that we might add a room or two, make this place a proper home for a family." Felicity propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the dim light of the banked fire. "A family." Vaughn smiled, drawing her back down against his chest. "Someday, if you'd like that, children with your courage and maybe my stubbornness." "I'd like that very much," Felicity whispered, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Very much indeed." Life settled into new rhythms as summer turned to fall. True to his word, Vaughn began expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area. His years on the trail had taught him many skills, including basic carpentry, and what he didn't know, he was eager to learn. Together, they improved the garden, added a milk cow and several head of cattle, and began to transform the modest homestead into a thriving small ranch. Word of their success spread throughout the area. The same townspeople who had once shunned Felicity now sought out her advice on gardening in the challenging desert soil. Vaughn's knowledge of cattle and horses made him a valuable resource for other ranchers. And gradually, they found themselves integrated into the community in ways Felicity had never imagined possible. Even Lucinda Porter eventually emerged from her self-imposed seclusion, though she maintained a cool distance whenever she encountered the Yateses in town. Her father, however, a shrewd businessman who recognized Vaughn's growing influence in the area, made overtures of friendship, inviting the couple to dinners and social gatherings. Amazing how money and success change people's perceptions, Vaughn observed dryly after one such invitation. Felicity smiled, long past the point of being hurt by the town's hypocrisy. "It's not the money or success they respect, it's you," she said, straightening his collar before they headed into town. "You gave me value in their eyes by valuing me yourself." Vaughn's expression softened. "You always had value, Felicity. I just had the good sense to recognize it." He kissed her lightly. "And the selfishness to claim it for myself." As winter approached, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain to the desert, Felicity made an announcement that filled their home with even greater joy. By next summer, their family would grow by one. The news was greeted with celebration throughout Copper Creek, with gifts and well wishes arriving from many of the same households that had once gossiped so cruelly about filthy Felicity. On a crisp December evening, as they sat by the fire in their now comfortable home, Felicity watching Vaughn carve a small wooden cradle for their coming child, she reflected on the transformation of her life in less than a year. "What are you thinking about, love?" Vaughn asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How quickly everything changed," she replied. "This time last year I was alone, just trying to survive each day. Now." She gestured around at their home, at the Christmas decorations they'd put up together, at the cradle taking shape under his skilled hands. Vaughn set aside his carving and moved to join her on the small sofa, drawing her into his arms. "Now you'll never be alone again," he promised, his hand gently covering the slight swell of her stomach. "None of us will." As the fire crackled and Scout dozed at their feet, Felicity leaned against her husband's solid strength, surrounded by the home they were building together. Outside, the desert night was cold and vast. But inside, there was only warmth, security, and a love that had begun with an act of simple kindness, a cowboy defending a woman's dignity by kissing her hands in front of them all. 5 years later, the Yates Ranch had grown considerably, with a proper house replacing the original cabin, a small herd of quality cattle grazing on their expanded property, and an orchard that was just beginning to bear fruit. The humble homestead that Felicity had struggled to maintain alone had blossomed under their combined efforts into one of the most prosperous small ranches in the territory. On a warm spring afternoon, Vaughn rode in from checking the fence line to find his family gathered on the wide front porch. Felicity sat in a rocking chair, sewing a tiny dress, while their 4-year-old daughter Emily played with blocks on a colorful quilt spread nearby. Their 2-year-old son James toddled around the porch, occasionally stopping to peer through the railings at Scout, now elderly but still devoted to his family, dozing in a patch of sunshine. The sight never failed to fill Vaughn's heart with a profound gratitude. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "There's my beautiful family," he called, smiling as Emily abandoned her blocks and ran to the steps, arms outstretched. "Papa, Papa, look what I builded," she exclaimed as he swung her up into his arms. "Built," Felicity corrected gently, setting aside her sewing to rise and greet her husband. "That's what I said, Mama," Emily insisted, pointing imperiously toward her block creation. "It's our house, Papa, see." "It's magnificent, Princess," Vaughn assured her, carrying her back to the quilt for a closer inspection. He set her down and pressed a kiss to the top of James's dark head as the boy clutched at his leg, demanding his share of attention. Rising, Vaughn crossed to his wife and drew her into his arms for a proper welcome home. After 5 years, the sight of her still made his pulse quicken. Motherhood and prosperity had softened the sharp angles that hardship had carved into her frame, but her eyes still held the same quiet strength that had first captured his heart. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his hand gently resting on the curve of her stomach where their third child grew. "Wonderful," Felicity replied, covering his hand with hers. "Dr. Miller came by while you were out. He says everything is progressing perfectly." "Of course it is," Vaughn said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You do everything perfectly." Felicity laughed, the sound as refreshing to him as cool water after a long day's ride. "Hardly that, but I do have some exciting news." Her eyes sparkled with barely contained enthusiasm. "A letter came today from St. Louis. My cousin Sarah is finally coming for a visit next month. She's bringing her husband and their children." "That's wonderful news," Vaughn said, genuinely pleased. Felicity's connection to her extended family had been tenuous at best after her parents' deaths, when poverty and distance had made communication difficult. In recent years, as their circumstances improved, she had begun corresponding more regularly with her cousin, the only family member who had maintained any contact during her darkest days. "I can't wait for them to see everything we've built here," Felicity continued, looking out over their property with pride. "Sarah knew me when I was just a girl in St. Louis before Father's illness. She's the only one left who remembers me from before. Before you became the strongest, most remarkable woman in the Arizona Territory." Vaughn finished for her, turning her face back to his with a gentle finger under her chin. "The woman who brave enough to face down an entire town's contempt with nothing but her dignity intact. The woman who made a lonesome cowboy believe in home again." Felicity's eyes softened. "You always see the best in me." "I see you as you are," Vaughn corrected. "Which is why I fell in love with you that very first day in town, watching you walk with your head held high despite everything they said." Their conversation was interrupted by a tug on Vaughn's pant leg. James had toddled over, arms raised in the universal demand to be picked up. Vaughn obliged, settling the boy on his hip. "Supper ready soon, Mama?" James asked, his small face serious. Felicity laughed. "So impatient, just like your father. Yes, it's almost ready. Emily, come help me set the table." As Felicity and Emily went inside to prepare the evening meal, Vaughn remained on the porch with James, pointing out the cattle grazing in the distance, the hawks circling overhead, the mountains that turned purple as the sun began its descent. These quiet moments with his children were precious to him, chances to show them the beauty of the land that was their heritage. Later, after the children had been bathed and put to bed with stories and lullabies, Vaughn and Felicity sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arm around her, their hands entwined. "I received another offer today," Vaughn said after a comfortable silence. "Porter wants to buy the north section of our land, offered twice what it's worth." Felicity looked up at him. "What did you tell him?" "Same as always, not interested." Vaughn's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "That land was part of your parents' original claim. I wouldn't sell it for all the money in Copper Creek." Felicity's smile was tender in the moonlight. "You're a sentimental man, Vaughn Yates." "Only with you," he replied, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. It was true. The hardened cowboy who had ridden into Copper Creek 5 years ago, a man who owned nothing but his horse, his gun, and the clothes on his back, had been transformed by love into someone who understood the value of roots, of heritage, of creating something meant to last beyond a single lifetime. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Arizona spring day. Breakfast was the usual cheerful chaos, with Emily chattering about her dreams, James making a mess of his porridge, and Felicity somehow managing to keep order while preparing Vaughn's lunch for his day's work checking the herd. As he prepared to ride out, something made Vaughn pause at the door and turn back. Felicity stood in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window highlighting the auburn in her brown hair, one hand resting on her growing belly as she wiped James's face with the other. Emily danced around her, singing a made-up song about butterflies. The scene struck Vaughn with such overwhelming love that for a moment he couldn't speak. This was his family, his home, his life, all things he had never expected to have. Blessings he had never dared to dream of during his years of solitary wandering. Felicity looked up, catching his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, a smile curving her lips at his expression. Vaughn crossed the room in 3 strides and took her in his arms, mindful of her pregnancy. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "How grateful I am that I rode into Copper Creek that day, that I saw you standing there with your head held high despite everything." Felicity's eyes grew soft. "I'm the lucky one," she whispered. "You saw me when no one else did. You valued me when the whole town called me worthless." "Filthy," Vaughn corrected with a small smile, remembering. "They called you filthy, and I knew the moment I laid eyes on you that they were blind as well as cruel. And then you kissed my hands in front of them all," Felicity said, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Changed my life forever with that one gesture." Vaughn captured her hand and pressed his lips to her palm, just as he had that day in the mercantile. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her skin. "First of many in a lifetime of loving you, Felicity Yates." As he finally rode out, Vaughn glanced back to see his family waving from the porch, Felicity with James on her hip, Emily jumping up and down with enthusiastic energy. The sight of them framed against the home they had built together filled his heart to bursting. The trail had been his life for so long, always moving, never settling. But Vaughn now understood that the greatest journey of all had begun the day he stopped, the day he defended a woman called filthy for being poor, the day he found the courage to put down roots at last. It was a journey without end, this building of a life together, and he wouldn't trade it for all the open trails in the West. From the porch, Felicity watched her husband ride out, her heart full of the same wonder that struck her each morning upon waking beside him. From desperate loneliness to this abundance of love, the transformation still amazed her. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle movement of new life within, and smiled. The desert stretched out before them, harsh but beautiful, challenging but rewarding to those with the strength to persevere, just like love, just like life. And they would face it together always.